Welcome to the second lecture for United States history. This lecture is about the American Revolution, which I'm choosing to call an uncivil war. A little bit of a play on words here. Because the American Revolution really is a civil war. It's British people in America versus British people in Britain. Even though it has been remembered very fondly as the war that establishes American independence, at the time it was incredibly violent and very destructive as these two sets of people identifying as British came to serious blows over the future of the American colonies. Our target is target 2.02. Let's begin. On the timeline of the events leading up to the American Revolution, we can think of them as either long-term or short-term. A good example of a long-term event would be the Stamp Act of 1765. It placed, as you might remember, a tax on paper, which required colonists to buy stamped paper, and they refused to do, and they burned a lot of stuff and got really violent, and the British backed down. Well, the American Revolution won't happen for quite a few years after the Stamp Act. So we can't say that the Stamp Act is an immediate cause. It's a long-term cause, a cause that is in the background, building slowly. A more immediate cause would be something like common sense, because it's much closer in time to the American Revolution. Common sense is 1776, January of 1776. The American Revolution is July of 1776. So you can see the distance between the Stamp Act in the Revolution and common sense in the Revolution is a very different distance. One is 11 years, one is mere months. So as we look at the lead up to the American Revolution, we can see there are a ton of long-term causes, things that happen 10 years before the revolution itself, 15 years before the revolution itself. In some cases, you've got the Treaty of Paris, the Proclamation of 1763, a Sugar Act, a Stamp Act, another set of taxes called the Townshend Acts. Then you have the Boston Massacre of 1770, but it's not until we get to 1773. In the wake of the Tea Act and the subsequent Boston Tea Party, the British really cracked down on the Americans, and that sets the stage for the coming of independence. There's actual fighting at each other in 1775 at Lexington and Concord. Common sense and Declaration of Independence is 1776. And then that begins the war for America's freedom from England. Is it a revolution? Is it a war of independence? It depends on who you talk to. And the colonial Americans certainly do see it differently than we see it today. For them, it was a moment where they could seize their destiny and retain all the rights and freedoms that they believed the British were taken away. That moment of destiny would not come to an end until 1783, when the ink was dry on the treaty that ends the American Revolution or the American War of Independence. And like many things in American history, I have a song that goes with all of these events. This song, which is not from the Revolutionary time period, but later in the 19th century, is a retelling of the events surrounding the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So I'll sing for you the melody Of course, we will do this in class as well. There was a rich lady lived over the sea, and she was an island queen. Her daughter lived off in the new country, with an ocean of water between, with an ocean of water between. And as you look at the rest of the verses, notice how the events of the Tea Party and the Tea Act get retold musically. Now let's focus on the war itself. As I said at the beginning, the American Revolution is really a civil war. It's one group of British people versus another group of British people. And 1/5 of the people in America decided that they wanted to remain loyal to England. They decided that their best chance for success, their best hope for freedom and liberty and the world that they wanted would be with England, not with an independent new nation. We call these people the Loyalists, but at the time there was a dirty nickname for them called Tory. These Tories were supporters of the king. Many of them were wealthier folks who stood to gain by remaining with England and actually could lose quite a bit if they supported the American cause. Many of them were worried about the possibility of independence, what it would do to the American economy, how it might unleash even greater problems. So a lot of them are afraid of independence, afraid of a war for freedom. There's about 500,000 of them in total to help the British. And sometimes they help the British very actively, sometimes it's very passively. Some people in America at this time just simply want to avoid ticking anybody off because they're afraid of what might happen. They're afraid of, getting attacked by either Americans or the British. So they want to remain a little bit on the more neutral side. Many of the Loyalists were native peoples. The Indians often saw the British as slightly better to them than Americans were, and they felt like the British would treat them better. Not all Indians supported the British. Some Indians supported Americans, and some Indians said we need to stay neutral. Many of the Loyalists were Anglicans, the members of the Church of England, and they felt like that was their identity. To rip that from them and support independence was not going to be possible. Many of the enslaved chose to support the British, particularly when the British promised them freedom. And then many of the wealthy also did support the British as well, since their money or their position or their titles or power would better be served by remaining with the British. If you look on the left, I have a map showing where the Loyalists are concentrated, and you can see that you're going to find more Loyalists in the north. You're going to find more of them in cities. So look at these coastal town areas here, Charlestown, Savannah, Wilmington. And that's not a surprise because that's where you're going to find more established wealthy folks, more established Anglicans. Canada does not choose to fight with America for freedom, nor do the British people in the Caribbean. So not every British person in Americas are going to support independence. Let's take a moment and look at the question of African Americans, Black British folks, and their position in the war. We do know that African Americans made some very conscious choices about who they thought would be more supportive of their overall goals. and freedoms. And that choice meant that some of them did willingly decide to go with the British. About 4,000 African Americans chose loyalism. Many of them were promised freedom by the British, and the British didn't always go through or come through with holding up on that promise in the way that they should have. And quite a few of those African Americans would leave with the British at the end of the war. About 5,000 black soldiers fought for America, sometimes by choice and sometimes not by choice. A favorite example of mine is Ned Griffin, who was a man in North Carolina, a black man in North Carolina, who was used as a substitute soldier for someone else. And the promise after the war made to him was that he would get his freedom. But he had to, of course, serve in the war first and survive it. And so the choice for fighting for America by these 5,000 shouldn't be seen as, yay, rah, 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 America. They're so patriotic. There could be a very selfish calculation there of this war of independence could be my personal independence and my personal freedom as well. Some African Americans thought, you know what, I don't care about either side. You know, I've not been treated well I'm not even treated as a human by either group. So we find lots of Black Americans at this time choosing another kind of freedom for themselves by running away. Historians estimate about 100,000 of them just simply disappeared in the course of the war because they recognized it was a good time to escape. You could take off and hide in the chaos of the war. Your master is probably off fighting, so, you know, what's he going to know? What's he going to be able to do? So keep in mind that conflicts like this offer choices for people to decide where they stand. And how they stand, what stance they take, doesn't always mean that they are in love with the patriotism of the country or the idea of the country. Sometimes they see it as a win for themselves as well as a win for the side that they choose. We are going to address some of the conflicts during the war, particularly some turning points, meaning times when you can see that the war definitely shifted and it looked like you know, the battle was turning or changing towards either the Americans winning or the British doing better. Or sometimes these turning points offer a chance to see where a different choice was made by one side or the other, and that choice does change the outcome of the war. Good example would be Saratoga, 1777. Saratoga is a battle that Americans win, despite the fact that they're weak and they really haven't won a whole lot up to this point. And they're fighting one of the most powerful armies and navies in the world. So the fact that they win this battle is a pretty significant moment for them. And the turning point here is that it lets the French know that they can now support Americans because Americans could win this conflict. Sometimes you don't want to loan people money or support them until you're sure they're going to be successful. And that's what the French were waiting for. So Saratoga results in an alliance with France, and France supports the United States with money and troops. In fact, you may have studied in world studies that the French will soon, in 1789, go through their own revolution, and part of the debt that causes their revolution is the debt of the American rebellion that the French helped pay for. The second point is Yorktown, 1781. The British had been fighting for years, trying to get Loyalists on their side, not always successfully. The Americans had been just trying to survive and avoid getting like completely wiped out. And finally, everything comes together at Yorktown, where the French and the Americans get a strategic advantage and trap the American army or the British army. The British are thunderstruck. It's reported that after the British lose at Yorktown, a song that is heard playing is "The World Turned Upside Down," a well-known song to both British and American folks, as if to say the most powerful country in Europe, well, kind of, but not totally, but certainly very powerful and wealthy and militarily advantaged, has now been beaten by this ragtag bunch of Americans who have very little money, very poor training, lots of infighting in their leaders, and generally not a really good chance of winning. But here they pull it off. Now, the British could have continued fighting had they decided, that this was not going to be it. But essentially, Yorktown is the end of the war. America, to the surprise of many, wins. The victory is celebrated in the Treaty of Paris, which annoyingly is another one of those treaties of Paris. You have to memorize the difference between it and the earlier one of 1763. This Treaty of Paris is the one in which America will be given all the land to the Mississippi River. Note, no one asked the Indians. That was not even a consideration. Indians weren't at this meeting to say, yeah, we don't approve of this. So giving America control of land to the Mississippi River was a pretty big assumption on the part of Americans about what the future would look like. And it would be a future in which Native peoples would not be in control of that territory. The Treaty of Paris also had to deal with some of the costs of the war, paying for damages, restoring property, things like that. But the Americans themselves would have to figure out how to pay for $101 million worth of fighting, which they did not have the money for in 1783, and in fact were perilously close to being bankrupt. That's $2.4 trillion today that Americans had to figure out what they were going to do in terms of financing this. This is a pretty big credit card payment. And then victory also had to deal with or reckon with that there were 217,000 American deaths. This is a war. It leads to death, and death rips people out of the economy. It rips people out of society, and that changes how people are going to have to, work and put things back together over time. So victory sounds really awesome for the title of this slide, and yay, Treaty of Paris and getting all this land. But wars have consequences, and it's important to remember that death and debt are two of the most important ones that every country must deal with in the aftermath of conflict. So this is the map at the end of the war. We've got a new nation to the Mississippi River, but really, does it control all of that? No. Native peoples control it. The Spanish down here believe that they control that, and so they're not going to willingly give that up to America. So this map is a little bit misleading. Just because all of this is colored in doesn't necessarily mean that it is all America at this point. That's very much an open question still. The bigger question is, will they stay united now that they're independent? It's quite easy to work together in a conflict when you have an enemy to fight, and that enemy unites you. But when the war is over and you no longer have an enemy to hate on collectively, are you still going to be able to work together? And that's a big open question for Americans. For the rest of the decade of the 1780s, Americans will struggle to answer this question as they disagree about the economy and their government, and even whether or not they would remain a united nation.